Welcome to the NJC's 10-minute takeaway, where we will try and cram in as much information as we can into a 10-minute workshop. I'm Tom Stenson, audit trainer and head of training for the NJC, and today I'm joined by Lynne Barrie, who is currently our president for the NJC and past chair, and a former teacher and audit trainer. Welcome, Lynne.
Hi, Tom.
In today's topic, we are going to be discussing all about adapting the lesson. And our time starts now. So what is, in your mind, Lynne, what is adapting the lesson?
Well, I think the word adapt can be misunderstood, really, because adapt it means to be flexible and alter it as it needs to be altered as the lesson goes on. It doesn't mean it will always have to be adapted. And it's not necessarily as big as changing the whole lesson.
Yeah.
I think ADIs and PDIs get quite confused by this because they've been told in the past, and this hasn't been updated for some time, but they've been told that it's the number one reason why people fail a standards check or a part 3. So instantly there's that sort of fear and barrier of, oh, what have I got to do with adapting a lesson? And people almost panic and sometimes adapt a lesson when it doesn't need adapting.
Yeah.
So we do have to be careful that we're doing it at the correct time. And I don't know about you, but I don't think that this necessarily means adapting goals, although that could be one way of adapting it. It might be adapting the route. You might have to adapt it because there might be roadworks in your area, or the route may be proving to be too challenging, or it may be proving to be too simple. Or it might be just the level of help that you're giving. So maybe you want to give less help and make the person more independent. And you hadn't really thought that would be the case, but after discussing it with them, you decided that you'd like to adapt it and change it. So that's what I feel about it. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much what you've said there. I often get the impression that people think they need to make it really obvious that they're adapting the lesson and it's such a big thing. But like you mentioned earlier, if we look at the wording, was the lesson plan adapted? Well, an adaptation can be very small and it can be very big. So, you know, there are times where I'm sure we've had to adapt the lesson and the whole lesson plan has changed because something's happened. Maybe the pupil is really tired, and so going on to the dual carriageways might not be the best use of our time from a risk management point of view. But other times, like you say, maybe just giving them slightly less help is a simple way of adapting the lesson.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that we have got to discuss that with the pupil. We can't just, I mean, sometimes in our own heads, we might be thinking, oh, I'll just adapt this route. And we don't actually need to discuss that necessarily with the pupil.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of things where if you do adapt them, so if you're going to adapt and change your goals or make one more of a priority perhaps than it had been when you started the lesson, then that does need discussing with the pupil. So just pulling over to catch up and asking them how they feel they're going so far. If they're doing really well with one of the goals, well, how about we can keep that in the background, but how about we bring this other goal that we had earlier and we put that as the priority now? Or, as you say, if something turns up that was a bit more unexpected and we need to make that a new goal, then is it okay with you if we make this goal a new goal now? Would you feel that's a wise use of our time for the next 20 minutes?
Yeah. And I think it carries on from some of the other things that we've said as well about keeping that pupil involved in the lesson and making sure that they've got that responsibilities, but also for me that they're understanding why we're adapting it, especially if perhaps something isn't going to plan and we need to look at a specific skill. I want the pupil to be able to understand, okay, yeah, I know why we're going off to go into this nursery area to go and practice this. Because again, if for me, it's still helping them to try and build their responsibility of what they need to do when they're on their own.
I did actually have this happen to me on a standards check. And it's interesting because the lad that I took was a partly trained pupil. We were looking at planning and awareness and trying to get him to plan further ahead, an eco drive, and that was the main goal of the session. But then when we got to a couple of roundabouts, after about 15, 20 minutes. Sorry, they weren't roundabouts, they were junctions. And it was obvious to me that he wasn't looking well enough. He was looking far too quickly to the right and not so much to the left or even opposite where there were driveways. And I watched him for the first one. And then when he did it again at the second one, that's when I came in and said, you know, we need you to be looking more than this. And we had a discussion about it. And he said he hadn't really realised that he wasn't looking properly. So I said then, well, should we change a goal then? Just for the next 5-10 minutes, should we just put the priority on where you're looking when I get you to some of the junctions? And afterwards, what the examiner said to me was, I was so glad that you got in and sorted out and changed, adapted with the observations, because I was sitting in the back thinking, you need to start working on this now, Lynn, with him. And at the first one you didn't, but then at the second one you watched him again and you came straight in and adapted. And so, you know, that's why I think it was a good lesson. And I did discuss that with the pupil. But it was necessary to do that because observations are so important and he was just missing them. After we got him doing it, we went back and we said, well, should we come back now to your anticipation and planning? But just remember where those observations are going to be.
And I've got a very similar one, but the opposite end of the spectrum. It wasn't on a standards check. It was on a lesson last year. And this learner had a bit of a break from his lessons. So we did our recap and he went through his progress sheet and he said, oh yeah, I remember our last lesson where we were doing these hill starts on junctions. So we'd agreed that the goal was for him to have additional help because he couldn't remember quite what he needed to do. So we'd planned a short route that was just going to take a couple of minutes. And I had the same. By the second junction, I realised that he was doing things before I was even starting to tell him. So at that point there, I thought, well, there's absolutely no point in me keep talking him through this. So with his agreement, I said, look, you're happy. We're not going to pull over. You're happy just to do these because you're doing everything before I need to tell you. And it was really good because his confidence built them because he really thought he'd forgotten what he needed to do. But just jumping in the car and doing it actually for him was a great thing.
It's funny, isn't it? When they've had a few weeks off, and sometimes for no fault of their own, it might be a holiday or they haven't been well. You tend to think that in your head they might have forgotten things and they instantly get in and say, well, I think I've forgotten. But I find sometimes like that, they actually do really well after they've had a week or two. Because they've really had to think about it and perhaps get in the zone before they get in. But there's two perfect examples then of adapting a lesson. But we didn't say to the pupil specifically, we're going to adapt this now, but we just discussed with them what needed to be done and what we were going to do to change it. So it's not perhaps as huge as some people like to think.
Yeah. Do you think that maybe from the DVSA's perspective, because it is on their top list of reasons for failing, do you think the shorter time period of the standards checks and the part threes have an effect on that?
On adapting the lesson?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I do think when I sit in the back now for 45 minutes, it is actually long enough to see what's going on. People can't necessarily pull over and have 5-10 minute discussions, but sometimes those discussions I used to find went on too long anyway. It makes people that little bit quicker. I think people shouldn't feel they can't pull over at all. If you need to pull over to discuss, then do, but make it quite short and snappy. But yeah, I'm not sure that it alters how much we adapt. But certainly having the 45 minutes, we've got less time. What's your thoughts?
Well, the reason I say that is one of the common things I see when I'm observing lessons is I might observe, let's say, an hour or a 2-hour lesson and we're having feedback throughout. And then at the brief at the end, when we're having a discussion, the trainees sort of say, well, you know, I adapted the lesson and learning took place. And I say, yeah, that's great. But could we have done it much earlier? If you'd recognised it, like you said on your standards check, if you would have left it much later, that would have had an effect. So I wonder whether sometimes that shorter period sort of affects people and they think, oh, you know, I'm used to doing 2 hours, but I've only got 45 minutes, but they don't necessarily adapt for that time period, which I suppose is all about us adapting again, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Being flexible again. But also, of course, what you've got to remember is that the lesson's already started.
Mm.
So the lesson might have started by 20 minutes or so before you get to start and meet the examiner. So in that case, it can still be, it is actually still your hour lesson. It's just
Yeah.
that you're being joined part way through it. And this is where we need to adapt and be able to cope with that.
Yeah.
But most PDIs and ADIs I'm meeting, and those that before we stopped doing the standards checks for a while, most of those had adapted quite well to 45 minutes, and the majority of them were saying to me that actually they preferred it.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear that feedback as well quite a lot. So,
Yeah.
well,
But I mean, I think the major thing is adapting goals, isn't it? We've talked
yeah.
about the route, we've talked about the level of help, but in the main, it would be adapting goals.
Right, that is the end of our 10 minutes. So thank you very
Wow.
much for, yeah, it goes quick, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us again, and we look forward to seeing you again.